Hello, dear friend. Thank you for hanging out with a couple of multiples today. We are your hosts, Drew
and Garden System. We are a married couple that both have dissociative identity disorder, or DID.
The reality of living with multiplicity is nothing like what you might see in the movies or on soap operas. This mental health condition often goes unnoticed, even by mental health professionals. Did you know that someone with DID spends an average of 6 to 12 years in the mental health system before receiving a correct diagnosis? This is because there is still a prevailing belief, even among clinicians, that DID is rare. The truth is that there are around 120 million people all over the world that meet the criteria according to the DSM-5.
We are glad that you are here to learn all about dissociative identity disorder. Whether you are someone living with multiplicity, a supporter, or a mental health professional, you are making a difference by choosing to listen to this podcast today. You can help dispel myths about DID and help spread awareness by sharing this podcast with a friend or loved one.
Please visit acoupleofmultiples.com and sign up for our mailing list to learn all about our private paid community called Hearts Multiplied on the Circle platform. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review. And for our Apple listeners, we would really appreciate you leaving us a written review.
Together, we can make a difference by taking the disorder out of dissociative identities. We are honored to have a Gold Plus sponsor for Season 2.
The Institute for Creative Mindfulness is one of the largest EMDR therapy training programs in North America, founded and directed by Dr. Jamie Pless-Marich, author of Dissociation Made Simple. Dr. Jamie is the only EMDR therapy trainer who is out as a plural, and since 2015, she's offered the full EMDR therapy basic training in a way that honors lived experience and destigmatizes dissociation in clinical work.
We have never felt more accepted and validated as a multiple than when we were able to show up authentically as Garden System for our basic EMDR training. Having lived experience is valued and respected in these training courses.
Go to www.instituteforcreativemindfulness.com for a full list of upcoming trainings, both online and in person, offered by Dr. Jamie and her selected network of EMDR trainers.
Are you interested in becoming a sponsor? Please send an email to admin@acoupleofmultiples.com to request more information.
Welcome, dear friends, to another illuminating episode with Drew
and Garden System,
a couple of multiples.
The reality of dissociative identity disorder.
Today we have Annie Goldsmith, RD, LDN, with us.
Annie Goldsmith holds an undergraduate degree from the University of Rochester in Brain and Cognitive Sciences and attended Winthrop University for her graduate coursework in human nutrition. Her educational and professional trajectory has always been guided by a strong curiosity about the ways our biology and psychology interact to inform our human experience. Annie worked in neuroscience research labs at New York University and Davidson College before pursuing a career in nutrition. She has experience treating eating disorders at the PHP, IOP, and outpatient levels of care. She opened her outpatient group practice, Second Breakfast Nutrition, in 2015.
Annie's practice is rooted in a foundational belief in the inherent worthiness of all bodies. She centers weight-inclusive, social justice-oriented, and trauma-informed frameworks in her approach to eating disorder care and recovery. Annie became interested in somatically and polyvagal-informed approaches to nutrition therapy in 2018 when she began training with the Embodied Recovery Institute, where she now provides training as part of the faculty. Annie has presented on the intersection of eating disorders and dissociation at the ISSTD World Conference, as well as the Healing Together Conference. Annie is passionate about working with clients from a bottom-up approach, centering and supporting the wisdom of the body and its innate capacity for healing.
Welcome, Annie. So glad to have you. We are looking forward to having an amazing conversation.
Hello, Garden System. Hi, Drew. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm excited to get into this really important and juicy topic
Oh,
of
absolutely.
Yes, we are
Yes.
of
too.
this
Oh,
intersection.
juicy was a
Mhm.
good a descriptive word we could have used. Yes.
Oh,
Oh, so much to get into. I was looking at some of the questions you sent me, and I was like, how are we gonna get through it? It's so much to this topic, which I think, just highlights the complexity of
It
it.
really
So
does.
I'm excited to dive in.
yay. Okay, so first, would you please tell us a little bit about how you came to work with dissociative disorders as an eating disorder specialist?
Absolutely. I would love to share some of that. So I think the thing that set the stage for me, that sort of started my brain sort of working in a way that allowed me to start to see things a little bit differently and understand, and maybe look through certain lenses that allowed me to sort of have a better understanding of what was happening for some of my clients who turned out to be more dissociative than I initially realized, is I started training about 6 years ago in a kind of framework that is called embodied recovery for eating disorders through the Embodied Recovery Institute. And I just talk about that. I mean, it just really informs so much of my kind of foundational learning. And what that modality is one of the uh, uh, people who developed this model. She refers to herself as a weaver. So that she's sort of taking all of these different threads of, from bodywork practice, from somatic practice, from, attachment theory, from, sense things from the OT field and sensory, and sort of weaving them together into an understanding of the complexity of the human body and the human psychology. And so what this framework, I think, did was helped me start to understand and look for things that just weren't sort of obvious um, on the surface. And so I started to learn more about dissociation. I started to learn that there can be multiple things happening on multiple layers, that people can be giving you a narrative about what's happening for them, but that their body may be telling a completely different story through the sensations that it's experiencing, through the behaviors that are coming out. And so I started to learn how to listen on multiple levels. Um, and I think it was that foundational learning that then, when I was introduced specifically to DID, which had not been really on my radar as a clinician, despite being in the eating disorder field for multiple years at this point. I actually, my one of my teachers, her name's Rachel, she was on an episode of System Speak, which is how I sort of stumbled upon that podcast quite a few years ago. And then I just kept listening, and my brain was like exploding. And what listening to just all of those different episodes and learning more about dissociation did is it gave me an additional lens. And then I started to apply that lens in my work, and start to look at the folks I was working with, especially folks who just weren't responding, quote unquote, to some of the more traditional approaches to eating disorder treatment that I had been trained in. And I started to say, I think some of these folks may actually have a dissociative disorder. And because um, some of the folks for whom I was thinking this might be the case had a therapist who was willing to listen to me and collaborate with me, which is not always the case.
Right.
um, with especially the dynamics sometimes between therapists and dietitians. This it's something that I could probably go on a bit of a side tangent about, but just the power dynamics within the eating disorder field itself.
Hmm.
Um, but fortunately, this lovely provider was really not dissociation informed, but open to hearing me, open to learning, open to being curious, and through that process, um, made some diagnoses of these folks that we were working with. And then once I realized that I was working with folks with DID and I hadn't known it, it made me, to me, I was like, okay, I have so much learning to do. And that just sort of started me down the path of just gathering all of the information that I could, seeking out resources, um, and then learning from my clients. And then as it kind of goes, it almost seems like an energy and a momentum starts. And now I say probably over half my caseload is folks who have DID, and it's just such rich and meaningful and powerful work that I am so grateful to do.
That's
That's kind of
wonderful.
how I got here.
Yes. Wow.
Well, I the
Yeah.
words that really caught me were to be open and to be curious. And I think that
Mhm.
is probably really what things boil down to, no matter what your, which diagnosis you're working with or what's going on, but being open and mindful and curious about what is going on. And not being like, oh, this is what it is, and like not even considering other options, and to be open to learning. Like, even though that therapist didn't know anything about dissociation, she was willing to learn. And I think
Mhm.
because there's so many aspects in our field, as a mental health, professional, that I'm new and upcoming here as a registered intern. There's just so many avenues, so many places to be training and learning, and education, I think, is just super important, that there's always something new to learn.
Yeah.
Ain't that the truth?
Mhm.
Mhm.
And the second you stop feeling that way is when you probably should start questioning. Right.
Always be a sponge, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. The
Uh-huh.
things that come
Yeah.
from mind to me is like really observing your client and asking, knowing what questions to ask. I think.
Mm.
This
Yeah.
is true. Knowing what questions to
Yeah.
ask. I would agree, because there are certain things I would never think to tell my therapist unless she asked me.
And sometimes the questions are so much more important than the answers, right? Like it's okay if, when I ask a question to my client and the answer is I don't know, it's like, well, that's okay. What
Yeah.
if we just hold the question? And sometimes that can guide. Sometimes being able to be in the unknown is actually such a critically important part of the work. Can we tolerate the not knowing and being in that space as we're discovering sort of what really is kind of at the roots of some of what's going on?
Beautiful. So, could you go
Yeah.
ahead and please define exactly what an eating disorder is for those listeners that may not know? Go over the types of eating disorders, and maybe touch on like that stereotypical, way an eating disorder might present versus what might actually, like, what should you be looking for? What will show up?
Right. Like, what does the textbook say
Right.
versus what happens in real life?
Yes.
Yeah. I think this is such an interesting question, because I think there's so many different ways to understand what an eating disorder is. We have the DSM. The DSM gives us very clear criteria for what an eating disorder is, and sort of puts eating disorders in these very discrete categories. We have anorexia, which comes with its own very specific set of behaviors and symptoms, mostly characterized by, restrictive eating practices. Then there is, bulimia, which is characterized by binging. Well, again, very traditionally binging and purging, although that it can really show up in so many different ways. And then, there's binge eating disorder. There's an eating disorder called ARFID, which stands for avoidant and restrictive intake and feeding disorder, which is just kind of a very wordy way of saying kind of like extreme picky eating, um, is often kind of how it shows up. And then there's sort of the catch-all OSFED, which is, I think it stands for otherwise specified feeding and eating disorders, which is basically the whole, like, you don't quite fit in any box, so we're just going to create a new box for you to fit in. However, as somebody who has worked with eating disorders for about 10 years now, I would say that I have moved so far away from conceptualizing eating disorders through the lens of what the DSM gives us, because what the DSM is doing is it is describing a set of symptoms and behaviors. What it is not doing is helping us understand what is actually happening for this person to drive behaviors that aren't really compatible with sort of thriving in the world. Um, and when I think about eating disorders, I'm always coming from a place of assuming that there is a logic. There is something that makes this make sense. And so the question that I'm always holding is, how can we understand what makes how this person is operating in the world makes sense. And so when I think about like a definition for what is an eating disorder, I tend to think of it more as a barrier to somebody's capacity to embody their ability to engage with their wants and needs from a felt sense of safety.
Ooh,
So
I like
often eating
that.
disorders, yeah, I'm glad. And I hope we can talk a lot more. Safety is a big word, obviously, in this area,
It is.
and so often it's like, is safety even available? How, it's a big word.
Right. That's where we kind of get that phrase
And
safe enough from. Yeah.
Right.
exactly, exactly. And so often that is where we are starting, and wait, and maybe where we are getting to. Um, but so often eating disorders, what they really are these adaptive strategies that are developed as an attempt to say what feels like safe, but is really actually protected in a context where safety is not either fully available or available at all, right?
That makes
And
sense.
so, in a context where safety is not available, eating disorders make a lot of sense.
So one thing you can
And this,
control, right?
it's the one thing you control. You can control, and I think we can. I think there's even more and more to it. I think that is one of the sort of classic narratives of eating disorders. They're all about control,
Mhm.
and that's absolutely true for so many people. Um, and when you start to look at what is what food really represents for a human being, right? Like when we really think about what is being expressed when we nourish ourselves, it is really often a reflection of how we are actually in relationship with ourselves.
That makes sense. Almost like a, do I deserve this? Do I like a belief about yourself?
Absolutely, right? And how I have wired up in a context where not only have I learned I don't deserve to have my needs met, but actually acknowledging my needs and trying to meet them is a threat to my safety, then responding to our own needs for nourishment actually can become very threatening.
That makes sense.
But we have to have a framework for that, right? Because as somebody just sitting on the outside, watching somebody engage in behaviors that are so clearly life-threatening, it's like, well, just eat. It's like, and so often I think for at least for the folks that I've worked with, is it's really hard to find language for, like, there isn't necessarily a framework for, but I can't, and it actually isn't safe, right? Because it's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. What's not safe is you not eating.
Right.
Yet something inside says, wait a minute, no, this is not okay to do.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yes.
Yeah. I know you have a question coming up here.
Yeah. So, yep, it's me, Drew, talking now. I know y'all can't see me. I was one of those individuals that started off in therapy because of my disordered eating behaviors. I feel like initially, when I went to this eating disorder treatment facility to receive outpatient treatment, that they went right to trying to change my behaviors without addressing my underlying trauma. I felt like the trauma I had been through was completely ignored. Could you speak to the connection between trauma and eating disorders and how often they're interlinked?
So I love this question. So thank you for naming it. And I also am so appreciative of you of sort of speaking about it also from your own experience, because I think that's incredibly important and powerful. And so often I hear over and over and over stories of folks I've worked with, or, through other, clinicians that I've worked with, of clients just describing either something that just wasn't very helpful or something that was extremely harmful. Um, and so often, then what happens is when that is named, right, they get labeled as treatment resistant or manipulative or some other sort of pejorative term for, well, you don't agree with me, the expert.
I have such issues with those terms of resistant and manipulative. Ooh.
Yeah, and that really was unhelpful for me in treatment because, like, they were telling me to eat. So if I didn't eat, then I was not pleasing them, but it was also backfiring in my mind because I wasn't supposed to eat. I'm not deserving of this, all that sort of thing. So it was just terrible.
Absolutely. And as you name that, I think about, right, essentially the double bind, the relational double bind that gets created, which is essentially a reenactment of so often the initial circumstance that led to the eating disorder in the first place,
Right.
which is kind of mind bendy, and so deeply harmful. Um, and yet it doesn't, it's so often hard to find language for it. But I think about sort of what you're naming, right? That there is, if what is happening is working within a power dynamic where there is a provider who knows what you need and is telling you about it, and it isn't willing to listen to you say, wait a minute, there's actually a reason why I can't do that. But also that provider is a gatekeeper to resources, right? I mean, you also sort of need them to stay alive, or maybe there are parts that sort of feel that sense of like, well, I have to sort of please this person because they're in a position of power. It becomes sort of like, okay, well, I can't both be in relationship with myself and my truth and this other person at the same time.
Right.
So I have to choose. And the default will always be choosing, that person in the position, the attachment figure over self.
Right. Which is probably why I stayed unwell for so long.
Attachment is so powerful.
Yeah.
I really, really mostly conceptualize eating disorders as rooted in attachment injury.
That just really fits so well with people I have worked with personally. And yeah. And I think about, I've never been diagnosed with an eating disorder myself. I probably should have at some point, but I think of different, when you talk about the power dynamics, like whenever I would get to a point where I'd have to go inpatient, like all of a sudden it was like no eating was happening. Like I would refuse to eat. And it wasn't, and it was definitely one particular part, because there were parts that were like, dude, we're hungry. What's your problem? And then that part was like, we're not eating. It's just not happening, and we would refuse. And there was this one point where I think there was finally a concession to let the little have breakfast that morning or whatever. And so like we're picking stuff out, and the little put a chocolate milk carton on the tray, and then she picked out a cereal she wanted, which then she picked out a white milk to put on the cereal. And then we got yelled at because we took 2 milks and we were only allowed to have 1 milk, and they wouldn't let us have it. And there was this huge internal battle of, well, see, we weren't gonna be allowed to eat it anyway. And like, yeah, it was not pretty after that.
And that, it makes me so sad because there's such an opportunity. It's just so many missed opportunities. And it's, on the part of providers to create safety. And in the name of treatment, safety gets lost. And then it's like, well, then what are we even doing here?
I know, like this guy had watched us refuse to eat for days, and then like fussed at us. Like, it's just unbelievable to like my adult selves going like, well, like you should have just let that slide. Yes, there's rules or whatever for whatever, but like that was a minor thing that should have been slid under, let happen. Like, dude.
Oh my goodness, that makes me mad.
Oh, there was a whole uproar in the whole unit because all the other patients were pissed. Like, it was not pretty.
Oh, I love that. I love that. So everybody was able to sort of like really sort of see that this sort of like rigidity around the rule system was like undermining, like actually really meeting you where you were and what you needed.
Oh, and what's worse is there was somebody else on the unit who probably had like 5 chocolate milks, because everyone kept giving him their milk, and like they just let him have like all these milks, which then my little was like, the anger level was through the roof at that point for the injustice.
Total injustice. When there's sort of like indiscriminate sort of like application of rules, but in a way that actually like isn't logical.
Right. Because like he didn't take like all those milks himself, just other people gave them to him.
Oh boy.
Yeah. Well, I think it like as you were talking, I was thinking of some experiences. I worked briefly in some higher levels of care, so I sort of know what sort of the table
Hmm.
stuff is like. And where I worked, there, I think there was even like a big poster in the dining room that was like, no excessive condiment use, and you can't, tear your food, or you can't, use excessive napkins, or you can't, like, there was very rigid rules around what normal eating was, which is funny as a staff person, because when we had pizza, I don't know, I found myself just like tearing off a piece like mindlessly, and then I was like, oh no, I'm using an eating disorder behavior. I have to stop.
Oh
Like,
gosh. Oh, that's too much.
um,
Whew.
but I think it really speaks to, when we get caught up in the presentation, the symptom, the behavior, versus understanding what's underneath it, what is the need, then I think we're gonna lose track of what's actually gonna be most helpful. Um, but I don't always know that the eating disorder field, in its models and conceptualizations of what eating disorders are, um, it has not been a conceptualization that is a model where trauma is understood as a driving force. There's a lot of conversation about genetics. Um, Honestly, that's like the biggest one. It's a genetic thing, or I think there's, we don't know, or it's, diet culture, and all of those things are part of it, for sure. But understanding of trauma, like I remember when I worked at this one treatment center and we were in treatment team, and I remember they were talking about discharging a client because they needed to go work on their trauma because we don't do that here. We work on their eating disorder here. Like, that was the conversation.
Oh.
Yeah, like
Like,
it's like you can't really
okay,
separate them. Like they're
no.
intertwined, And so that's my next question here, like what could clinicians do to make sure they are treating the underlying issues instead of just trying to
Mm.
change the behaviors themselves? Like how do you combine these treatments together?
Well, yes. And so I want to go back, and say a little bit more about some of those underlying
Yes.
connections between, trauma and eating disorder behaviors. And this is something I'm super passionate about. And maybe it just comes from my particular interest. A little back information about me: before I was a dietitian, I actually studied neuroscience. Like, my undergraduate degree is in something called brain
I
and
keep
cognitive
wanting to do that
sciences.
myself. Like, whew,
That's
love
awesome.
it.
I mean, I loved learning all about everything I learned in school. And then I went and worked in research labs for like 3 years. And I was like, oh, wow, this is not the thing. Like,
Oh.
it's fascinating to read about, the outcomes of studies that took 10 years to do, but like actually like sitting there in a
Oh
research
yeah.
lab, like, it is tedious and it's just very isolating.
You have to be a
Not my personality.
certain type of person to do that.
I'd get lonely then.
Yeah.
I'm very outgoing. I have to talk.
That'd probably be my work.
When it's just you and the rats, they do not talk back, let me
Oh
tell you.
yeah.
Um, so so, but when I started doing my training with, the Embodied Recovery Institute, and learned about polyvagal theory, um, and it opened my eyes up to some really foundational connections between eating and trauma, which is our autonomic nervous system. So there may be, probably a variety of people listening, from people who are like total polyvagal geeks to people who've maybe never even heard of it. So just like very briefly, polyvagal theory was, coined by this neuroscientist, Steve Porges, maybe about only 30 or so years ago. So still kind of relatively new. And basically, we've always known we have this autonomic nervous system. It's the physiology of the body that sort of does the stuff that's outside of our conscious awareness, like regulating our breathing rate and regulating our heart rate and our temperature and all the stuff that if we had to spend our conscious thought regulating, we'd get nothing else done, right? And it also impacts our appetite and our energy balance. And what Steve Porges kind of discovered in some of his studies, at least this is what his theory says, is that, we used to think we had this sort of just two-part system, that we had, our kind of sympathetic nervous system, which sort of like mobilization. Often in trauma world, we think about it as what drives that fight or flight response. We also have a parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and digest system, but also is what mediates that dissociative response when our ability to sort of take meaningful action is sort of overwhelmed. Sort of that possum playing dead kind of response. And what Steve Poor just said is that actually, well, it's not just this two-part system, it's actually a three-part system. And that that parasympathetic is actually two different branches, and that it evolved during different parts of our evolutionary history in response to different survival pressures. So that kind of possum playing dead part is a much older structure that is just really about like very primal responses. But that we actually have this other branch of that parasympathetic system, it's called the ventral branch, that it actually responds when we are in connection with safe others. And that it evolved because we learned that in order to survive, we need to be able to read social cues so that we can stay part of the in-group, right? Because way back in prehistoric times, if you got kicked out of the tribe, that was it. You were like saber-toothed tiger meat, right?
Safety in numbers.
Right.
Absolutely. Which is why that, ability to feel a sense of community and belonging is so, so important for our sense of safety in the world. It's not just about, I'm not being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, but it's also like, do I have a place to come home to where there is a fire and there is food and there is clothes and there is shelter and there is community, right? And that's really what the attachment system is all about. Is that in order for us to really feel safe in our not just in our minds or whatever sort of construct about that, but actually in our physical bodies, in our neurology, that we have to have the felt sense of connection with other in order for those regulatory processes to come online. And what is really fascinating is that because it's that same neurological scaffolding, it's that same autonomic nervous system that is constantly responding to where is their threat, where is their safety, where is their, safe other. It's doing all of that. It's also driving our ingestive processes and our digestive processes. So
yeah, it's all connected, right? Like there's stuff that connects right to your gut. Your gut is also a sign of the things that are going on in your body.
100. There's a reason why we say like, oh, I had a gut feeling.
Yeah.
Right? Like that comes from somewhere. And there's so much we're learning about that, right? Like how people are talking about like the gut brain and how much of our serotonin is actually made in the gut, and that there's like neurons,
the amount of neurons that are all throughout our body, like our neurons are not just in our brain. Like we have brain cells on our heart and we have brain cells in our gut. And like, of course.
Science is so cool.
Of course we do. Like, how did it take us so long to figure that out?
Absolutely. And it's fascinating to look at the history, to sort of go back to like, Descartes and that sort of like mind body dualism, and how we really, so much of Western culture has disregarded the wisdom of the body.
Right.
And it's all about the intellect and all about reasoning, which of course is important, but
it's not the whole picture.
It leaves so much out.
Yeah.
It leaves so much out. So all of that to say is that, it's just running on the same system. And so, of course, if we don't feel safe, we cannot eat normally. Like that's a biology thing. And so trauma and eating disorders are absolutely inextricably linked. Eating disorders are so often an expression of what the autonomic nervous system is, like how it wired up in the context of there was too much that wasn't safe and there wasn't enough that was.
This makes so much sense. This is something I'm going to be able to take back when I go back to work this week. I can't say more than that.
I'm
That's
so
enough.
glad.
But that was good. That was good. Ooh, I just made several connections right there. This is going to be good.
It helps me understand my own personal history too. Kind of all makes sense. And it's such a simple thing to understand too. So that's really cool that we could, have that.
It does feel kind of like it's not that complicated.
No, it legit makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And something that's really cool, I mean, even the way that y'all are like responding right now, it's like my guess is that it's not just your brains that are saying that it makes sense, but probably something inside, like, like a felt sense of like, oh, that's congruent with some internal felt sense. It's not just, oh, there's a logic to it. It's like, oh, something else tells me that, like, yeah,
like
that
I
tracks.
feel it right through here. Right through here is what I'm feeling. And I'm just kind of
Mm.
pointing for those that can't see, right through my center. Like this is where I'm feeling, which that's right where your vagus nerve runs through, right? Right through here. Yeah, that's, I can feel it in my body there.
That is very, very, very cool. And I think about that, and I think about so often the narratives that folks are given, like in treatment, about why they're doing what they're doing. It's like, oh, you're afraid to be fat, or oh, it's just about control, or oh, it's just about, that's just your eating disorder talking, and because you have this genetic predisposition. And I think what can happen is what they're experiencing, but maybe don't have words for, is the incongruency between what their bodies are saying, that gut felt sense of what is true, and then the narrative that they're told, no, that's true. And so when I'm working with folks, and I'm always very careful to offer this information and kind of say, hey, like, let's try it on for size. It's a different way of thinking about this. I'm not saying this is true for you. But when people can hold a cognitive narrative that actually is congruent and matches what is true in their bodies, right? Even if the cognitive narrative is, I'm terrified. I don't feel safe in my body. Just to be able to have the congruency there can actually start to bring people into a more regulated state.
That makes sense.
My brain's connecting so many things right now.
Me too.
I'm glad. I'd love to hear more.
I know.
Like, I'm talking so much. I get it. Like, yeah, I'd love to hear, like, what's landing for you guys.
The thing that's really landing for me is the idea of the safety, the idea of community, and about like when you're lacking that safety, lacking that community, lacking those connections, like that affects your eating, and trauma is most definitely, has to do with that sense of safety, has to do with that sense of attachment, and how when you are in that healing process and you are reconnecting and building your support system around you, and you start having community, and after kind of being isolated, a lot of times that happens with trauma survivors, is you end up in that, oh, I'm alone. There's nobody here. Nobody gets it. I've been reacting. Friends have turned away from me because I'm like, rah! I'm like, they can't handle it. Like, but when you rebuild and have that community around you, how things change, because you then have rebuilt that sense of safety. There's going to be some things that I'm going to be able to take back as a therapist and use. So, and I would say more on that, but I can't, because that would violate confidentiality. We can't do that. So,
got it.
Yeah,
totally get it.
For me, I was definitely told that my issues were because it was the one thing that I could control, which I did relate with, because there wasn't a lot in my life that I had control over. However, I think now, after this, what we've talked about here, like, it was definitely about attachment. It was definitely about, I was not safe. I was not safe growing up at all. I literally thought maybe I had months to live at most at times. So it was a constant sense of not being safe. It was a bunch of things, but yeah, it wasn't just about control. And yeah, I realized that now. And yeah, I think if the people that were trying to help me realized it was all those things and not just that, it would have been less of an issue. Probably would have resolved some of these things sooner. So
yeah. mean, my reasons
Mm,
for not eating were definitely about control, being impatient, and I was just mad because I had nothing in control, and you can't
Yeah.
make me eat. Like,
Right.
make me. Like, that part's attitude was like,
Mm-hmm.
make me. Like it was not pretty.
totally. And what if, and even as you say that, right? Like what comes up for me is the response being like, oh, to be so curious about like like if someone's not eating, like for me, I'm just like, oh, I want to understand that because because it is income. If we're looking just at like now time, like present day, right? And it makes you less safe, right? It's incompatible with your survival today. Yet your system is saying this is going to give us the best chance of coming out on top in this situation.
Mhm.
Like understanding why seems so critically important versus just being like, well, no, you have to eat.
Right.
Right.
It's like, what?
I think there was
Yeah,
very
that seems
much
to key to
a
everything.
power struggle because in that particular incident that we talked about earlier, like that was not a place that was informed about dissociation or DID or any of the
Mm,
things. We weren't really telling people we had DID at that particular point either. So I think there was probably a lot of unknowns happening for everybody else. So it was very much, a power thing. And because if we could have the power, then we could be in charge and we would be okay. And we're
mm-hmm.
very much about feeling safer when we feel like we're in charge. There's definitely some safety to that.
I could see that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about the dream
Mm-hmm.
I had last night about being a queen. Haha. And there was another queen that was not happy that I was a queen in this dream, and we were like, but we're the queen.
Hysterical.
We definitely have an obsession with the evil queen from Snow White, which is really from the TV show Once Upon a Time, Regina. That's a whole thing right there. So, but yeah, it all lines up with the control power thing for us. Like, yeah, that makes sense for us.
Yeah.
But again, it's about
Well, and
safety
that's
because I'm safe if I'm in control. I'm safe if I'm in charge.
can I respond to
Yes, go
that?
ahead. This will
Like
be
there's something
great.
that comes up for me about that. And this is something we talk a lot about in embodied recovery is really distinguishing between safety and protection.
Hmm.
That um and we can think about that through the lens of the defense system and the attachment system. So often, this is something I got from my mentor. She'll often use this like sharks and boats
Hmm.
metaphor, where to sort of talk about distinguish between safety and, or excuse me, our defense system and our attachment system, and we'll kind of say like, okay, so imagine that you're stranded in the middle of an ocean,
Okay.
and a shark swims along, right?
Okay.
Okay, well, you got to engage our defense system, right, in
Okay.
order to get away from that shark, because our defense system is all about disconnecting from sources of danger,
Right.
right? But even if we manage to swim away from sharks, are we safe? Well, no, because we're stranded in the middle of an ocean, right?
Right.
And so we also really, to actually have safety, what we need is a boat.
Right.
We need connection.
Hmm.
And I think so often safety and protection get conflated,
Hmm.
right? Like in the field. Um, and so when people are talking about how do I get away from something,
Hmm.
right? How do I right? Because you're talking about, if we're talking about like power over, that is a form of disconnection, right?
Right.
And so it is protection, and which is valid. It's absolutely valid. And I think when we're talking about the attachment system and safety, right? Well, what is really required there um, is vulnerability, right? How do
Yes.
I be with somebody else with my defenses down?
That like makes so
And
much sense for how our system operates. You've got like Leanna and Keelara, even Sadie a little bit, who are definitely like on that power, as the protection piece. But then the connection, like the system will switch, and then you have Daisy, who's all like, "I love everybody."
it, it makes, and And there are times when we have to be in protection, right?
Right.
I mean, this is not about being undefended and vulnerable all the time.
Right.
So often it's, when I'm working with my clients, it's like, how does your system have the flexibility
Right.
to be able to sort of come into that state when it truly is safe, right? How does it start to recognize and differentiate? Because that is the state that is going to support the embodiment and the physiology to be able to nourish yourself really, really well.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, you're up next.
All right. What should eating disorder specialists look for to avoid missing a dissociative disorder in their clients?
That is a really great question. I read an article recently that was from the 90s because it was when people could actually talk about dissociative disorders without it being completely taboo.
Right.
And what they said it was in the abstract of the article, that if you are working with somebody who is not responding to all of the traditional treatments, that in and of itself, like that sort of severe and enduring presentation, is enough to suspect and start to assess for a dissociative disorder. I mean, they talked about, it was MPD in this article,
Right.
because
Back then,
it was,
yeah.
back then. And so, and it's really interesting because I do a lot of consultation and supervision, and sometimes I feel like a broken record because people are bringing me their hardest cases, and almost every super consultation that I do, I'm like, has DID been assessed for? Because I really think that's, when somebody isn't responding to those more cognitive, logic based, whatever,
CBT like things.
exactly. Yes,
I'll say
exactly.
it.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, oh boy,
I
yes.
know.
I'll go there with you.
Sounds great.
That in and of itself is enough to sort of do some deeper digging. But I honestly think if you're working with eating disorders, you should always be curious and assessing for dissociation. I think you should just be trained on what to look for.
There's so much,
and it's different for everybody.
Yeah, there's so much covertness hiding that
Mhm.
happens with dissociative disorders that it's really important to do assessment for and to keep it like on a shelf in your mind, and look for, could this be a reason that, their struggles going on. Whenever I see a lot of ambivalence, whenever I see a lot of struggling with making decisions or even lack of motivation, it's like, what's behind
Mhm.
that? Especially when what's presenting in front of me is very adamant about all the things they want to do, but then they don't follow through. Like, what's keeping you from following through?
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think that's where resistance comes in, like where they don't do any of the homework, they don't practice any of the skills. I think those are huge signs to really dig deeper, and a lot of people don't realize that they have alters or parts. Like, it's so covert that they can't even recognize what's happening
Mhm.
inside.
I have definitely, that that is familiar, what you're describing.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think it's that, again, getting back to that sort of like the multiple layers of stories that
Right.
are happening, right? Like there's the story that someone is telling you, and then there is sort of how much congruence is there between what somebody's saying and what they're doing and what they're experiencing. And when you sort of look at all of that and sort of see like something's not adding up here.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it's just that sense of like something's not adding up here. That sort of makes me kind of curious. I think also in the eating disorder field in particular, oftentimes there can be this real focus on the here and now. Maybe I don't know. I think it can vary between eating disorder therapists, but with dietitians, it's very much the here and now behaviors. And something that I will do is I get really curious with people about like, well, what was your what was your birth history? I mean, really going all the way back. I have worked with folks where, we can really track their eating disorder back to a traumatic birth. Or I've worked with somebody whose eating disorder was rooted in the fact that they had like multiple ear infections that went unnoticed and untreated, and it actually sort of facilitated like a need for dissociation pre-verbally, right?
Right.
And I think when a lot of this stuff wires up pre-verbally, um, there isn't a cognitive narrative for it.
Right.
And so again, people are sort of having a whole body story and body experience and all of these adaptations that happened so early, but they don't necessarily always know why.
Right.
And so maybe they've created a story about it or someone else has given them a story about it. And so sometimes we have to do a lot of being very curious and helping to sort of try to get more of a sense of cohesion in all of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And like thinking back to the question, like what should we be looking for? Could you give maybe like a couple specific huge red flags that should be like, we should like do the DES, or we should like really look a little harder into this? Like what could be something another dietitian or another eating disorder therapist would pick up on? Like what should they look for?
So really specific.
Yeah.
I think what you named about sort of if someone's coming in and saying, I really want to make this change, like, I don't want to do this anymore. And they're verbalizing a lot of motivation. Maybe you've done all this motivational interviewing work with somebody, and then they're just going home and repeating the same patterns of behavior over and over and over. That there's some dissociation happening there. It does not necessarily mean that it's DID or, that sort of end of the spectrum. But there is a dissociative process happening. And so that for me is a really big one. I think, I think another big one is when I notice that I'm feeling confused, like as provider, where I'm sitting there going, again, something's not adding up here. I can't put my finger on it. I don't know what it is, but I'm feeling really lost. Like I can't find my footing.
That makes sense.
That is a sign for me to not say like, wow, you must be a really crappy clinician, Annie, but more like, okay, maybe I'm responding to something that's actually happening. Kind of here.
I think that's room. A good one. When you're feeling unsettled in yourself and you can't follow, you can't track, and you're like, what's happening? Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Thank you. I think that's good. So in your experience then, what are the most effective ways to treat an eating disorder?
That's a big question.
I know. I'm asking a lot.
I think really there is no one size fits all. I mean, I think that's the first thing.
Right.
And so it is really, I think, about just like so much about the healing process. I think it is about the therapeutic relationship.
Yes.
If we are talking about safety, being the neurological scaffold that actually supports the process of ingestion, digestion, and elimination, then how are we facilitating a therapeutic relationship that then holds the container for whatever that person needs for their healing work? Whatever sort of specific interventions or types of support that they're going to need. I think so often, and I'll work a lot with a lot of people who have seen dietitians where it's been like, here's your meal plan, and then they're coming in every week and it's just like kind of, did you meet your meal plan? Did you not meet your meal plan? What are we going to do? What goals are we going to set? And there's this sense of whether or not I am pleased by how you're doing is whether you come in and have performed the things that we have talked about. Right? which is really, and because you're struggling and you need my support, I hold all the power, right? Like
Right.
I am a gatekeeper to resources. And so really being able to be explicit about the power dynamic there, addressing that in the room. I will often be very explicit with people in saying, me as a resource for relationship and support for you is not contingent upon the behaviors you perform in your recovery. Those things are separate. We are in relationship and I am a source of support no matter what you are doing.
That's super
How do we come
important.
to,
The
yes,
relationship
oh,
is
sorry.
everything. The relationship is, we learned that in grad school, right? Like then they tell us like,
Well,
chill,
you
chill
did,
out
I didn't.
everybody. They say, chill out everybody. Like really the most important thing is your relationship. You know, you can screw a lot of things up, but if you have a good relationship, it's all going to be okay. You know, it's like, yeah, right. Like it is, you know, but there's something as you were talking, like, I mean, it's a little side trail here, a little slightly off topic, but it popped in my head as you talked about the meal plan. Like I give you the meal plan and if you perform or not, and I'm like, and Daisy's like, well, does the meal plan include mac and cheese? And Kilara's like, we're not supposed to be eating mac and cheese. Like there's these rules, right? So like, but like certain alters like certain foods over others, right? And depending on like who's out eating, like we're at a restaurant, Kilara orders this beautiful like adult like salad with the grilled chicken and you know all the vegetables and things, you know, but then we switch before the food comes and then the waiter puts this salad in front of us and Daisy's literally pouting like, what is this? I don't want to eat this, you know. I'm like, there could be right there some issues with why food doesn't get eaten.
I had to explain to the waiter that everything was indeed okay, even
it
though
was
the
not
face...
okay. There was no mac and cheese on my plate.
that they had brought the right meal that was ordered, but
that waiter really looked dejected because Daisy like really like
it was
face. We were like
no other
out in our chair,
like
we really just fell back
pout.
and like
yeah.
It was bad.
That makes so much sense. Yes, makes so much sense.
That could be something else a dietitian could be looking for, right? When they're doing a meal plan and like they say they like this food and then suddenly they're not eating that. Like, I don't like that food. I don't want to eat that. I don't want that on my meal plan. Like, wait a second.
Yes, or if someone's doing like a food journal and you're like, wait a minute, like this looks like my 5-year-old would have made it, and this looks like a chef made it. Like
there are some discrepancies in food preparation. Yeah, some days we had the salmon and the black beans and the corn and the salad, and other days it's chicken nuggets and it's mac and cheese. Like,
which listen also is true for you know whether I mean that's true for me. Like that's true for you know all of us. So. It takes a lot of nuancing to. Yeah, I'm just being curious.
It does. It really does. Yes, so many factors. All right.
But yeah, so I think just to kind of wrap up that question that you just asked. I mean, my training obviously is in this one specific modality, but I think any modality that really allows you to stay more in curiosity than a sense of coming in knowing what this person needs, a sense of knowing how much this person is an expert on themselves. And I'm actually thinking, when I was looking at this question, I was thinking about your interview that I was listening to the other day with the IFS person. And it's like, how do I bring my aspects of self, right, to a session? How do I bring my curiosity? How do I bring my compassion? How do I bring my creativity? And if I can stay in that place, you know, that's going to support the client. So I think that also makes me think of the fact that, like, in order for the clinician to do a really good job in supporting others, we have to be looking at our own stuff. We have to be doing our own healing. We have to be doing our own supervision. We have to know where my strategies and my fears and my dysregulation may be clouding my ability to actually view the person in front of me with that compassion and curiosity needed in order to be a source of support for them. Because if I'm in my own fear or if I'm in my own stuff, which I certainly have been many times over the years, right? And I can't come back and with awareness and repair and apologize. That's where we get into all sorts of reenactments and
Oh yeah.
fun
You know,
issues on that,
and something I would really like the therapists who are listening to remember is that you're working with people, the traumatized people who probably never ever have received an appropriate apology in their entire life. And I still remember the first time my therapist gave me an apology with like no defense, no nothing, just I'm sorry I hurt you, and I'm sorry that I did that, and like that was it. And I was like, but you're not defending yourself. Like I'm not wrong for wanting this. Like it was just this really pivotal moment, that
Mm,
just, so in any of the things that you do, to recognize when you can just do that for somebody, like it shifts so much for that client.
mm.
Like, yeah, that's a really important thing.
Yeah, I'm sorry is a very important clinical tool.
It really is.
Mhm.
It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. You're up.
All right. You said you like working with clients from a bottom-up approach, centering and supporting the wisdom of the body and its innate capacity for healing. Would you speak into that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think as we've talked a lot about throughout today, um, eating disorders, in my opinion, are really genius survival strategies. Um, I think that in the absence of resources in situations that are just untenable, right? Somebody figured out how to survive. Um, and eating disorders really can support surviving the unsurvivable. I have a lot of folks I talk to who will share that it was a way to sort of be here and not here at the same time. I mean,
Mhm.
they are quite inherently dissociative in many ways, because it is a way to interact with the physiology, right? And sort of and state shift. And so while they are really helpful for surviving, they are not so helpful for thriving, right? And so when somebody's context changes, and maybe there is more safety in the external world, but the strategy persists, right? Because that patterning is so strong and parts may not even be oriented to current time and all of that. That's when there can be the shift where the eating disorder itself, becomes a threat to survival. If what we are doing is using a more top-down approach and asking somebody to simply change the behaviors without supporting them in having the bottom-up support, that the rewiring, so to speak, so that they can have a felt sense of safety in the body, that can then make it make sense to engage in a thrive versus survive way of being in the world, right? Essentially what we're going to do is be asking them to engage in behaviors that would indicate that they are safe when they don't know that they are. And so you are essentially then, I believe, supporting an increase in dissociation in the system, right?
Right.
Because I now have to disconnect from how unsafe I am in order to do this behavior, even though this, you know, over here does not allow
Right.
for that.
Mm-hmm. If there's anything that people with DID know how to do, it is to mask and pretend and please and do whatever that person says so we can move on. Like Daisy knows how to pretend to be an adult and gets away with it all the time. It's very frustrating sometimes, but it happens.
Well, and I think that's why so often I have had clients who have just gone through residential treatment and partial hospitalization, just the ideal patient, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they get home and it's right back to
Yeah.
these patterns, and people can stay stuck in that for a really, really long time. Um, and so it is a slower path, and often it requires the clinician to tolerate a lot more of their own discomfort, because as people are doing this work, kind of bottom up to start to learn how to engage where safety might be available in the system,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be a rocky road on the behavior front, you know?
Right. And like it will kind of look worse before it gets better, but you're not actually going backwards.
Not at all. Quite the opposite,
Right.
right? Yeah. But I think, to come back to clinicians doing their own work, I mean, it can be really scary, and it can be really scary.
Yeah.
I have, yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm thinking of my next question because we're kind of starting to answer it, right? So the question is in what ways does having DID affect the treatment of eating disorders? So like how would a clinician then know that they're not actually going backwards? Like, I think those are kind of like combined in a way.
Ooh, that's a really fabulous question. So I think just in kind of speaking to this overall question of in what specific things might a clinician need to know when working with someone who has DID, that might be a little bit different than
Mm-hmm.
somebody who doesn't. Um, I think a big one is being aware that the person that you're talking to in session
Mm-hmm.
may not be the part or self who is doing or driving the behaviors. Um, and so you might be spending a lot of time talking to someone who has no control over any of the stuff that you're talking about. So really, and this is where the nutrition work and the therapy work, I mean, it all kind of happens in this container, right? Because sometimes I've been working with somebody who is doing a lot of really important work in their therapy around communication and collaboration, or supporting specific parts who are really stuck in a trauma, like, trauma time, where I know that my job is to sort of support them in staying sort of stable enough
Mm-hmm.
until that system is working together a little bit more, so that the part that is really driving those eating disorders becomes a little more on board for, oh, maybe something could be different, or, oh, maybe we don't have to operate that way anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that I'm not also kind of communicating as a whole with the system, although some of it really gets into like trauma work that is
Yeah, and I
what the
see the
therapist is
need
doing.
for the internal communication that needs to take
Mm-hmm.
place. And I don't know, you want to talk more about your two parts and the way they present differently? I thought that would be
That's the next
coming.
question.
Oh, it is the next question. Okay, yeah. Yeah, let's get into that. Like, we can
Okay.
combine like that with how does DID affect the treatment? I think that would be a good story.
Okay, so I do have a few parts within my system that really used to butt heads because they exhibited opposite and contradicting disordered eating behaviors. So my part Lizzie, her thing was to restrict. She wouldn't eat. I was told that this was giving me a sense of control, but now we know, it's about attachment, it's about not having safety, all those types of things. And then my part Journey would binge. Over time, I figured out that Lizzie's behavior triggered Journey because Journey holds the memory of food being withheld from us. So Lizzie would restrict to try to make up for the quote damage that Journey had done by eating so much. And it was a constant battle for many years of my life. So my question is, how can people with systems manage parts who have multiple disordered eating patterns within their system?
Yeah, I think that's a really common dynamic that can happen in systems, and it's absolutely so pertinent to this conversation we're having about like internal communication, right?
Right. Yep.
And I think what you're naming is such a great example of, often I think, what's sometimes called polarization, where I think of it as like, it's like two people on a seesaw trying to keep things balanced in these very, like, on these very far ends, right?
Right.
And so if, somebody's binging, it's like, I have to go really extreme over here in order to balance things out.
Right.
Um, and because, and with what you named too, like, both of those things are the way that each part of self developed as an adaptive strategy to a very specific context that is probably held in very compartmentalized and sort of separate aspects of experience.
Right.
I'm taking a guess there.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, part of our growing up was we needed to be thin in order for what was happening. So it was expected that we didn't eat. And so, but like another part of me remembers being hungry and the other part doesn't, that type of thing. So,
yeah. Because that's also part of surviving, is is eating.
Yes.
Right. And so it makes sense that it's like depending on it makes so much sense that these parts can get so sort of separated out
Right.
and
Yeah,
held
because I wasn't safe
separately.
when I was eating. I would get in trouble, that type of thing. So,
Mm-hmm. 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 So I think that, I mean, in my experience, and I think it goes back to what we were just talking about, just that sort of really slow work of building internal
mm-hmm.
communication and collaboration, um, so that there can be this, because really, I mean, what is happening with this seesaw, right, is things are sort of getting evened out, right? There is this very delicate balance that gets maintained. It just
Mm-hmm.
gets maintained in ways that are not really workable in a
Right.
kind of,
Drove me
right? Like,
nuts, man. Like, and I think that's why I never was diagnosed with like anorexia or bulimia, even though I had all those symptoms, because it was technically evening out and I wasn't fitting all the
yeah,
criteria for either one of them. So, yeah, very interesting.
Kind of goes back to that idea of parts can
yeah,
have their own diagnoses sometimes.
absolutely. I think there can be parts that, present with, what someone might call anorexia, and then another part of the system presents with what someone might call binge eating disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and overall, it allows the whole system to survive, which is critical, right?
Yes.
Right.
It's just, it comes with all of these,
Right.
it's so much struggle.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I think eventually what did help was learning to listen to my other people's. Like Lizzie needed to listen to Journey, and Journey needed to listen to Lizzie. And when they understood each other and what was going on, that made them have compassion and like know, why. And so that eventually got me to where I'm at right now, and it's a lot healthier place. And it was because of understanding. So,
Yeah, getting your different selves to listen to each other and
mm-hmm.
to have that understanding and compassion for each other, which is a really difficult skill when you've gone through trauma and have never experienced anybody listening to you or understanding you or even showing you compassion. Like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you know how to do that for yourself?
Right.
Absolutely. And I think a lot about this sort of like, what is my role, in somebody's healing journey. And I think that I'm just thinking about some folks that I've worked with, like to sit with, the different um, selves as they're sharing what they're going through, is to be able to kind of be like, yeah, that makes sense. And oh, yeah, that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. And that I'm sort of trying to hold the big picture and sort of and sort of creating a container in which hopefully then as they experience like, oh, just having the experience of that nuance of the both of multiple things being true, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
this makes complete sense, and something else could be different that could make things easier for us, and this person's not judging me for it, and it's okay that I'm where I am.
Yeah.
It seems to create a capacity that then supports parts doing that for each other.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, really, like
Um,
we learned how to treat ourselves by the way our therapist treated us. I mean, when we got to her,
mm,
we were a hot mess, very judgmental and cynical and like pessimistic and all the things.
yeah. Which is why it feels so critically important that eating disorder treatment become more trauma informed. I mean, some of the things clients have told me about the way that like the eating disorder voice, as it's so often referred
Oh,
to,
right.
like
Mm-hmm.
is treated. I've had someone tell me that they were instructed to like draw a picture of their eating disorder and then like rip it up and basically like be like villainize it, like demonize it. Like,
And you don't want to
it's like
do
that's a
that when you
bad
have
part of
DID.
you.
Like when it's DID, you cannot
Oh.
villainize any part of yourself.
Oh.
DID or not, right?
Right.
Whether it's a more IFS part or
Yeah.
a
Right. Right.
dissociated part. It,
You need
when
acceptance
we
of all
are,
selves.
yes, Yes. And that's something that I think really maybe shifting within the field. It's hard because I'm so outside of some of those spaces these days. I don't know. I'm hoping things are shifting, but I think in a lot of spaces, it's still like, oh, hear what the eating disorder says and just, that's a bad part, do the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just, it's not helpful.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So going back to like your neuroscience information that you have, that training you have and the work you've done with eating disorders and so forth, what can you speak to about what is happening in the brain and body when someone is developing or has developed an eating disorder? Like what are those differences on that level?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's so fascinating about eating disorders is they really are that this sort of nexus where kind of psychology and physiology come together. So there's a lot that's happening. And I think it's very individual based on the individual circumstances that somebody is navigating. Kind of going back to some of the ways we've been talking about this, I think people, what they're doing when they're developing an eating disorder is developing some kind of adaptive strategy or strategies to successfully survive, navigate, whatever challenges that they're facing. Um, and because food and nourishment are also foundational and key and primal, right, for our survival, there are then impacts from starvation or malnutrition or just chaotic ways of nourishing themselves that then sort of almost take on their own traumatic impacts, right? Because it is a lack of safety that becomes overwhelming to the system, right?
Yeah.
And so it can become really difficult to tease apart. And I've certainly worked with folks where by the time, with like long eating disorder histories, where a lot of what they consider their trauma is the impacts of navigating and living in a starved body. Like that actually becomes its own
Right.
its own source of trauma. Um, so
It's
it's so
complicated.
complicated.
Yeah.
And
But we know, one of the really, if there's people are interested, there's a study you may be aware. Have you ever heard of the Minnesota starvation experiment?
I
no.
haven't.
Nope, not me either.
It's really, can I share just a tiny bit?
Yeah,
It's
Yes.
please do.
fascinating.
Mhm.
This study was done by actually a pretty famous researcher named Ansel Keys, who has anyway, he's controversial, but
Okay.
this was back in the 40s, I believe, when people were coming back from war and there was a lot of starvation, and there was this idea that they were going to really study the impacts of starvation on the human body so that we could understand it better as people were trying to help
Right.
people who were
Mhm.
experiencing this. And so I think it was 30 men, conscientious objectors from the war, entered this study, and they picked them because of their robust physical and mental health. Like they gave them a battery of all the tests, and they were,
Mhm.
totally no depression, no anxiety. They were healthy young men.
Okay.
And what they did was they put them on a semi-starvation diet.
Mhm.
Um, and over I think it was 6 months of that part of the study, and then it was another 6 months in the refeeding phase.
Mhm.
If I'm misquoting that, I apologize. But what they did was they tracked their physical and their mental health. And fascinatingly, I mean, the changes to their mental health was um, like astounding. Like, I
Wow.
mean, they developed really high depression scores, really high anxiety scores, meeting diagnostic criteria for OCD, self-harming, engaging in eating disorder behaviors, a lot of intrusive thoughts, and the amount of time that it took to sort of come back to baseline was like over 6 months in the refeeding phase.
Wow.
Wow.
So it starvation profoundly impacts every single part of our human experience.
Hmm.
Um, Not to mention, of course, there's all sorts of physical things that happen in regards to our heart rate, in regards to our ability to regulate our temperature, in regards to our ability to, um, you know, how we move and engage in physical activity, our cognitive abilities, all of that gets impacted as well.
That is some profound information that everyone needs to know. I have more thoughts, but we'll let that go.
I can't help but go to my teacher mode when my kids come in without breakfast and stuff. And I'm just, like, you need food to function and to learn.
Yeah, it's important on so many levels.
Over a long time like that, it's going to have some really big impacts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it can be hard to tease things apart. What I will often say to the folks I work with is, food is not medicine, and you cannot eat your way out of anxiety. There's no perfect diet for curing depression, right? Food isn't going to fix, quote unquote, whatever's happening with mental health. But if you are not well nourished, it will undermine it.
Yes. It's an important piece of taking care of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wow. All right. Yeah. Okay. Next.
What has changed in the treatment of eating disorders over time? That's a big question.
Yeah. And I mean, I can speak to that just through the lens of what I've seen. It's hard for me to know exactly everything happening in the field right now, because I think a lot is happening. And it really depends on where you look. And I think what can be really challenging in the eating disorder space right now is there really is quite a bit of variation in the field. And there's also quite a bit of disagreement about what best practice looks like. It is not, it's a fractious time in the field. Probably not unlike other areas in mental health, right? And I think that some of that is born from folks who have had marginalized experiences having platforms to actually be able to have a voice and speak out about some of the harms that have been happening in a lot of these fields for a really long time. And so just like in many other fields, I know this is happening a lot in the dissociative field as well. In the eating disorder field, there is a huge sort of growing awareness about, social justice, trauma-informed practice. And there has been a call for these long-term practices that have sort of been in place to really be re-examined, and also to sort of look at who are the ones in power, who are the ones speaking about this, and what's the perspective that they're coming from to sort of say what is the right way, quote unquote, to treat any of these conditions. And so, and I know this gets into the next question too, with eating disorders, it is hearing from folks with eating disorders. It is also hearing from folks with other marginalized identities that impact having a body in this world. So folks who live in larger bodies or identify as fat, folks who live in black and brown bodies, right, who's experienced violence and marginalization because of their bodies, folks who live in trans bodies or gender nonconforming bodies, who have experienced violence just simply for being in the body that they're in. There is a growing and important awareness around these issues that is shifting the field, but as always, there's backlash. There's folks who are resistant to change for a myriad of reasons, not all of them nefarious, but some some more than others. So it's really, really, it's wild times to be in the field. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah, I mean, because you're touching on the next question here, which seems to carry a lot of controversy, but especially between eating disorder therapists, the eating disorder world versus like the medical doctors and so forth. And my mind is like totally blown away, like listening to both sides of these, and when I first started working with a client and doing that consult with the eating disorder person, and that person was like, a Snickers is a Snickers. It breaks down. It's the same components. And I remember just having this, like, if you tell my littles that they could eat a Snickers bar and the same as eating a salad, like we're going to have problems. Like, and I really struggled with like how she was saying that, and so this movement, the HAZE movement, right? So the healthy at every size really seems to have become kind of like the norm in many of these eating disorder treatment programs. So Could you please speak about HAES and what it is and what does it mean and how is it helpful, or what are like, give us both sides of this. I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, and I will tell you, I've been, this is very personal to me. I've been on a real journey myself, and I think my training with embodied recovery has helped me. So I'll kind of try to give a nutshell of some of what
Yeah.
my journey has been. But so first of all, what HAES is, so health at every size. I will correct you. It's not healthy at every size. It's health at every size, and you will get pushback on that.
Okay, good to know. See, like, I don't know. I'm not eating disorder trained yet, people. So don't shoot me.
because what at least in its original iterations, there have been some very big changes even within that health at every size movement over the last couple of years as well. So there's like layers of complexity here. So without getting into too much of that, just because we just don't have time, what it's really about is body autonomy. I think at its roots, that it's not about saying like, oh, no matter your size, you're healthy, because health can, first of all, what is health and how do we understand that through an ableist informed lens and all of this stuff. But also people have more or less access to health, however we define that, at all ranges of sizes. So what it really is about is dignity and the belief that no matter somebody's size or health status, that they are deserving of person-centered, respectful care.
Absolutely.
There is a lot of sizeism in our world, where if living in a larger body comes with all sorts of stereotypes.
Right. Like size
really
does not
negative.
necessarily indicate health.
Absolutely not. You can be in a much larger body and be in a very healthy body in terms of your biomarkers and your physical activity and your nutrition behaviors. You can be in a much smaller body and have a whole host of health problems. And so it's like, how are we understanding and defining health, and then also recognizing that when we use weight as a proxy for health, we do a disservice to everybody. And for folks who live in all size bodies, because sometimes, I mean, I see this in my much thinner eating disorder patients, is they'll go in and be told, oh, look how healthy you are. Oh, you're a runner. I mean, I just had this situation happen recently where I working with somebody who's very physically compromised because of their eating disorder. And then the medical, person hears that they're running some obscene amount of miles a day. It's like, you are so healthy. Keep doing what you're doing.
Oh my gosh. So like this stereotype of if you're thin, you're healthy, like that could be a real disservice.
It is a real disservice, and it is fuel on the fire of a lot of for eating disorders. And it can be a real it's such a difficult situation to be in as a provider, because sometimes I'm so worried about somebody. I'll say, I need you to go to the ER. Like, I need you to access immediate medical care. And they go in and they come out being told how healthy they are, and it's like reinforcing.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. And so it's a very difficult calculation. It's like, when do you tell someone to go and when do you tell someone not to go? And it's very challenging. But that's not necessarily what,
I mean, I think that's a very enlightening thing to like recognize that just, person's body size does not necessarily mean they are not, healthy in that sense.
Absolutely. And also importantly, because HAES was developed to address discrimination of folks in larger bodies. I mean, we know that, so often somebody goes in, maybe there's something going on with their knee or some other, medical complaint, and they come out with a prescription to lose weight.
If you just lose weight, you should lose weight first, like, hello, like I am a 30-something at the time, I'm a 30-something-year-old female. Like even if I have some extra pounds on me, I should not be experiencing XYZ at this point in my life, but being dismissed simply because I wasn't within the markers was very frustrating for me.
Yep.
It's lazy and negligent medical care is what it is. And, I think I I also feel really bad for doctors who are stuck in a system that also does not support them. Like, I think it's layers and layers of lack of support, and
So
they're beholden to insurance companies,
Right.
and it's a big mess. But
So I have kind of another question within this question, which I didn't quite put down, but I'm thinking of, like, so somebody is, say, in an eating disorder program, and this particular person is in a larger body and wants to be in a smaller body, but yet they're kind of told they can't, and like the excuse is haze. Like, could you speak about that a little bit?
yes, and that is a fabulous segue into, I think, what has become some of the journey that I have been on in my own thinking about a lot of this. So, haze is presented as a paradigm shift from traditional ways of thinking about weight and health. But I actually have come to disagree with that.
Okay. I'd love to hear it.
Why. Yeah. And, I'll probably get canceled for saying some of this, but whatever.
We're all allowed to have our opinions, and that's how things change, right? Like, that's how we know. Like, if somebody didn't say the earth was round, we'd all be running around thinking it was flat still, just saying.
Right. So, yeah, well, but except that guy got his, like,
I know, that's a whole nother story, but, you have to be a little bit on the outlier and take that risk, right? He'll be okay.
That's right.
I'm not canceling you. I'm keeping you.
No, I actually am a very outspoken person and really couldn't care less. But so one of the ways that people will talk about this movement is they'll say, like, anti-diet, right? And to speak to, I think, some of the ways that it can get into almost a binary. And I don't think everybody I think actually many, if not most, haze providers come at things from a more nuanced place. But I think the way that it's sort of like put out into the world is, okay, so we're going to reject everything about diet culture, which diet culture is bullshit. And we should reject diet culture. It's not a way to think about how we can take care of ourselves and others in the world. But if what I'm doing is I am positioning myself in opposition to something, and I'm basing my entire philosophy in a reactionary stance, then I'm still giving this thing a lot of power. And I'm also losing potential resources that are associated with this original thing, right? So, like, to speak to the whole, like, Snickers and salad thing,
right?
Like, when we are holding a Snickers and a salad within the lens of diet culture, we have good foods, bad foods,
right,
which is incredibly unhelpful for our relationship with food. However, if we are going to take an oppositional stance, then what you have is, well, it's all the same, which is also not necessarily true. Like, morally and, hopefully maybe relationally, we can hold these foods sort of more neutrally, and without shame and all that stuff. But how, the Snickers just isn't a salad.
And
it
doesn't have the same
neither
vitamins.
one is good and neither one is bad.
Right.
There's a time, and it's like, how are we evaluating the context in which I'm going to make choices about when I'm going to choose what? And if I reject everything that comes along with diet culture, which does talk about health and all of that stuff, then I might lose the ability to evaluate those things with the nuance needed to truly support myself.
Right.
And so I think the real paradigm shift is not having either paradigm. It's like coming into something that, and I think that is the embodiment paradigm.
I mean, if salad wasn't so strongly associated with quote, quote, diet culture, I don't think my littles would hate it as much.
Totally.
Yes.
Which is really sad because
salad is actually kind of yummy.
It is.
Yes, I'm talking now. Like,
well, it can be, and it's like, what is a salad? Because there's all sorts of different ways salads can be,
and you can make a salad like be really unhealthy too. Like, just because it says it's a salad doesn't mean it's good for you. I could do some things.
I had a client tell me about candy salad the other day. I think that's a TikTok thing.
Yes.
But I mean, so I think that, and I do think that ultimately it's sort of the foundations of the health at every size philosophy we're meant to sort of speak to. It's about embodiment. It's about body autonomy.
Yeah.
I do think the discourse has become quite polarized.
Yeah. I mean, because like when you read it from the medical doctor's side, they talk about it as being dangerous, that we're giving people an excuse to not take care of their bodies. But then on the flip side, like, you've seen doctors who have treated people absolutely horrifically just because they are in a larger body, and our body shapes are all different. And yeah, like, so I always kind of really felt stuck with like listening to, especially as a newer clinician coming in and having clients with eating disorders. And I'm like, whoa. What am I supposed to be doing? Which one is right? Which one should I be listening to? And like, so it just like, I really think it's good we have this conversation, because I think that it gets twisted a little bit because of the polarization that happens.
Mm-hmm. And I also think in the spirit of the way that I think we often work in the context of dissociation, multiple things that don't go together can be true at the same time.
Right.
I think that gets highlighted for me often when I'm working with someone who has an eating disorder and diabetes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly. Like there's certain things, like your diet has to change a little bit based on how your body's. I think that's where I really got stuck, is having polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is makes you very high risk for diabetes, because your body literally does not digest food the same way anymore. Like there's too many hormones, there's a lot of imbalances. And I think, when you're treating the eating disorders, there's a lot of nuance. Like if you bring somebody in and then force them to eat a bunch of things that would then throw those hormones even more out of, like, that's where I think I get scared as a clinician.
Yeah. And I absolutely agree with you. I think that I think in the fear of reinforcing diet culture,
right,
can lead us into a place where we aren't really just looking at the whole person and their psychological needs and their relational needs and their physiological needs and all of it. And it's really tricky. It's really
it really is. We need to embrace the complexity, as Jamie Marich likes to say. Embrace the complexity.
Yes.
And it's okay. I think sometimes it can feel really hard as a clinician too if you don't have like the answers, right? And so it's like nice to be able to be like, oh, well, it's this. And so then I can just like be like, no, it's, you don't have to worry about that, and it's this, and it's like be very clear about something. And I think it's a lot more difficult, but a lot more true and compassionate to sit with someone and say, this is so complicated and there aren't really great answers here.
We keep trying to use science to treat things when it's really more of an art form.
The more I've learned about science and the scientific method, the more I have learned how little we know.
Yes.
Yes.
Especially when it comes to nutrition. Oh man.
Yeah, this is true.
Yeah.
This is true.
Yeah.
I just feel like we could talk for hours.
I know this is our longest episode yet, but I think it's worth it. It's absolutely worth it.
So, oh my goodness. Yes, this has been so amazing. I have so much to think about, and it's just been awesome. Is there one last thought you'd like to leave with everyone today?
Just, I think, thank you. I'm so hopeful that the more we are speaking about the intersection of trauma and eating disorders and trauma-informed eating disorder care, that we can really make a change. So thank you for the platform. Thank you for the work that y'all are doing in the space. And I'm just glad to get to chat. This is fabulous.
Thank you. I think I'm really excited about this. I think this is going to be very informative and educational for so many. So how can people follow you or contact you?
I don't really do the social media thing. I do have, I think my Instagram handle is second_breakfast_CLT. Second Breakfast Nutrition CLT.
We'll find it and put it in the show notes.
I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina. We can post it, but I have not posted anything there in a long time. I can't with that
Right.
particular environment these days. But my website is secondbreakfastnutrition.com. Also, if anybody's interested in learning more about embodied recovery, they can go to embodiedrecoveryinstitute.org. And yeah, that's how you can find me.
Every time I see Second Breakfast, all I can think about is Lord of the Rings and the Hobbits. And they're like, well, what about Second Breakfast?
Well, that was the inspiration. That is, yes. I am a huge Tolkien geek.
That's awesome.
I relate to those hobbits. Well, what about Second Breakfast? We're hungry again.
Second breakfast and 11sies and supper and dinner. And yes, gotta have them all.
And then when they get that special elf bread and Legolas is like, one bite can feed a full grown man. And then the hobbits are like, well, how many did you eat? All right, very good. So thank you for this amazing and important conversation, and we appreciate you sharing your knowledge and experience with us today.
Oh my gosh, this was so lovely. Thank you.
Thank you for hanging out with a couple of multiples.
We are honored to have a Gold Plus sponsor for Season 2.
The Institute for Creative Mindfulness is one of the largest EMDR therapy training programs in North America, founded and directed by Dr. Jamie Pless-Marich, author of Dissociation Made Simple. Dr. Jamie is the only EMDR therapy trainer who is out as a plural, and since 2015, she's offered the full EMDR therapy basic training in a way that honors lived experience and destigmatizes dissociation in clinical work.
We have never felt more accepted and validated as a multiple than when we were able to show up authentically as Garden System for our basic EMDR training. Having lived experience is valued and respected in these training courses.
Go to www.instituteforcreativemindfulness.com for a full list of upcoming trainings, both online and in person, offered by Dr. Jamie and her selected network of EMDR trainers. Thank you to our bronze sponsor, Alex Amar, LCSW, who offers weekly creative art classes, including the Creative Journal, Soul Collage, and Altered Books, all on the Zoom platform exclusively for people living with dissociation.
For more information, check out her website at alexamar.com, spelled ALIXAMAR.com, or her Facebook page, Dissociative Creative Explorations. Are you interested in becoming a sponsor? Please send an email to admin@acoupleofmultiples.com to request more information.
From your host, Drew,
and Garden System,
thank you for listening to A Couple of Multiples, the reality of dissociative identity disorder. This podcast is intended for educational purposes and is not a replacement for therapy.
Listening to this podcast does not constitute a therapeutic relationship with the hosts or any guest speakers.
If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. We would love to hear what you enjoyed the most.
You can visit our website at acoupleofmultiples.com for additional information, including how to join our new online paid community called Hearts Multiplied, to access additional resources, and to also subscribe to our mailing list to receive future updates.
Remember, you matter and are loved for being all of yous.